My name is Edgar Mannheimer, and this is Kalam, a podcast about the Middle East.
And my argument that I always say is that because our masses, the Arab public and the Egyptian public in particular, is extremely anti-Zionist and extremely pro-Palestine, this is precisely why we have the authoritarian governments that we have. Because a democratically elected Egyptian government would be automatically anti-Zionist and therefore a threat to the state of Israel that's on its borders.
That was the Egyptian writer, researcher, and DJ who lives in London, Nihal El Aasar, today's guest on the Kalam podcast. As I'm in Cairo right now, which you might be able to hear from the background noise I'm desperately trying to keep out, I thought it fitting to publish this interview today. We recorded it on May Day, the 1st of May, and we'll be getting back to Nihal and her thesis on Egyptian democracy in just a second. But first, a gentle reminder. For continuous updates on the podcast and posts about historical figures and events related to the Middle East, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Kalam Podcast. Soon, we'll be on TikTok as well. And if you like the show, please subscribe to Kalam Podcast and give us a rating in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now. It helps other people find out about us. And if you'd like to support us, you can do so. Join our Patreon community for just $3 a month. There, you'll gain access to full-length interviews and lots of bonus material, including our new series, Kalam Shorts. These are 10 to 15-minute explainers about important terminology like Zionism and Orientalism. Now, back to the show.
بناها الكفاح بدم الشهيد بنار السلاح فلسطين دولة بناها الكفاح بدم الشهيد بنار السلاح تعيد النبات إلى
Palestine is a country born out of struggle, by the blood of the martyr and the fire of the weapon. This is the 1970s poem Palestine is a Country by the Egyptian radical poet Ahmed Fuad Nigm, sung here by the enigmatic, blind Sheikh Imam. The two of them composed and performed hundreds of highly politicized, deeply satirical, and often quite raunchy songs that were a constant thorn in the side of the Egyptian regime, particularly under Anwar Sadat in the 1970s, a decade that closed with the Camp David Accords, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Ahmed Fuad Nigm and Sheikh Imam are emblematic of the Egyptian working class attitude to Israel, and by extension opposition to the Egyptian state, which it cooperates with on several different levels. Egypt, with the exception of the elections following the 2011 revolution, has never seen a democratically elected government, and today's guest, Nihal El Aasar, argues that this is directly linked to Egypt's peace treaty with Israel. In other words, the Western world, spearheaded by the US, has a vested interest in keeping Egypt's government anti-democratic and authoritarian, because if it represented the will of the people, it would be a direct threat to its neighboring country, Israel. Indeed, as we've talked about in the third episode of this podcast on the 1967 defeat, Egypt waged several wars with Israel in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. After listening to our conversation, please check out the Verso Books anthology From the River to the Sea, Essays for a Free Palestine, a collection of essays published after October 7 on Palestinian liberation, completely free of charge. In it, Nihal writes an essay entitled Bread, Freedom, and an Arab Palestine, an allusion to the 2011 Egyptian revolution slogan, Bread, Freedom, and Social Justice. Now, without further ado, here's Nihal. Nihal El Aasar is an Egyptian writer, researcher, and DJ who lives in London. Nihal, thank you for your writing and your activism, and welcome to the Kalam podcast.
Thank you for having me so much. I really enjoy your podcast.
Thank you. So you're in London right now, and you've been there for the better part of the past 6 months since October 7. What's it like being a pro-Palestine activist in London right now?
Yeah, so I'm actually a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. I don't know if you're aware of it,
Yeah,
but it's a grassroots organization that is comprised of Palestinian and Arab youth in the diaspora, and its aim is to empower the diaspora to own the Palestinian struggle and politicize Arab youth. The Arab dimension is a big part of the organization as well. The purpose is to liberate our homeland, so that's why it's open to Arabs as well as Palestinians, to make us the subject of history when it comes to Palestine as well.
yeah. And what about like the specific climate in London? I mean, the UK infamously is part of this kind of like colonial alliance of countries that are just cannot criticize Israel, and society is just kind of warps. You know, liberalism turns into this kind of like weird colonial fascism whenever Palestine is the subject. So how has it been in terms of that agitating and protesting?
So actually, in London and England in general, there's a history of, but mostly so London, there's a history of internationalism when it comes to the left. So even in I don't know if you remember, but in the uprising in 2021, when Sheikh Jarrah was under attack, in the Unity Uprising 2021, we still saw in London protests that were about 150,000
Wow.
protests in size. It was the biggest protest globally, and
Yeah.
people were surprised at the numbers. But now, since October, people have been mobilizing in the streets every 2 weeks, and 150 is a low number. We've
Yeah.
seen the biggest number was in November of last year, when the 11th of November, I think, when the biggest demo was almost up to a million. It
Wow.
was 600,000 to 800,000 strong. And week in, week out, people are in the streets for Palestine, be it in the national demos that are happening almost fortnightly, or in local actions or in workplace actions. But there is agitation all around. Obviously, since October 7th, especially in those first 2 or 3 weeks, as in most other countries in the West, there's been some draconian measures being taken against Palestine activists and even people in solidarity, people getting fired for tweets,
Mm.
people getting visits from the police, people getting visas revoked by the Home Office simply for tweeting for the resistance.
Yeah.
In the US, as horrible as things are right now, and we're seeing what's happening in the encampments, and how
Yeah.
the police have been really violent towards the student mobilizations. But in Britain, since Tony Blair and the counterterrorism laws that Tony Blair put, there really isn't that much, freedom of speech. Like, for example, my comrade Mohammed Accord gave a speech about against Zionism in one of the national demos, and he got interviewed by the police for it.
Yeah.
People holding signs equating Zionism to Nazism get tackled by the police and arrested. They put these things under hate speech and consider,
Oh.
Zionism or Zionists to be, a group of people,
Yeah.
a targeted group of people. Yeah, we've seen people taken, have charges against them for stickers, for signs, and it's really up to the interpretation of the police and the state.
Mm.
And of course, the Home Office is using its powers to against precarious people on visas to not,
Right.
extend their visas if they're deemed as a threat, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder where all those free speech activists on the right are right now. It seems insane that you'd use a better part of your career and power to defend the right to say like the N word or something. And when it comes to literally criticizing an ideology and calling for the liberation of people, that's all of a sudden that's I mean it just strikes me as insane, like everything that's going on in the UK
Yeah.
and Germany and the US.
Yeah, but still, there's a strong anti-war movement here, at least.
Yeah.
And a poll that was conducted as far back as October in Britain, a YouGov poll showed that 76% of the public wanted a ceasefire back in October. So, we're really seeing that like the mass number of people around the world are really anti-war. And that is really sharpening the contradictions globally
Yeah.
when we see how this isn't translated to our political elites and, it's really showing how democracy is sham, that the will of the public is not translated to political decisions at all.
Yeah, yeah, and that kind of brings us into the main topic of our discussion, because I think that rings true for most countries in the West. I believe most populations in the West do want a ceasefire and do not agree with the politics of sending billions of dollars worth of arms to Israel right now. But it certainly rings true when it comes to Egypt. And a lot of people right now are talking about the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, which is obviously preposterous. When 15,000 children have been murdered, it's obviously a war on Gaza. But you, Nihal, you've written a great deal about the larger Arab dimension to let's call it the crisis in the Middle East that's been going on since 1948. In the collection of essays for Verso Books, Essays for Free Palestine, which coincidentally is free of charge, you have a chapter called Bread, Freedom, and an Arab Palestine. And in it you speak about Egypt's predicament when it comes to Palestine. And so how is it, let me ask you this, how is it that the Egyptian state is at peace with Israel while the Egyptian population largely supports Palestine?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, I think, when it comes to the Palestinian question, because usually, as you say, it's been abstracted. Palestine has been abstracted to be seen vis-a-vis Israel only, and even more so, it's been divided. It's been seen as like you said, Israel-Hamas war, even Israel-Gaza war, and it's also, divide Palestine internally, but also separated it from the larger Arab world, which it is part of. There is an understanding that the Arab world identifies more strongly with the Palestinian struggle, which is why we've been hearing and seeing comments from the start of Israel's assault on Gaza, such as, where are the Arab states? What have they been doing? Why are they not doing more? And my argument that I always say is that because our masses, the Arab public and the Egyptian public in particular, is extremely anti-Zionist and extremely pro-Palestine, this is precisely why we have the authoritarian governments that we have, because a democratically elected Egyptian government would be automatically anti-Zionist and therefore a threat to the state of Israel that's on its borders. So, obviously along with other factors, but this is why the authoritarian states that we have are propped up by the West and by the US.
Yeah.
Even so, we've seen that the Arab world and the so-called Muslim world also used interchangeably, and this attempt to frame Palestine as a Muslim issue only, even here in Britain, even in America, when they see, Muslims as a voting bloc, trying to mystify this and show that it's not a humanitarian issue, it's only a Muslim issue. Only Muslims care about this.
Yeah.
And this wittingly or unwittingly plays into the Israeli and Western narrative that this is a question of religion, viewing the Palestinian struggle through this idealist or culturalist lens rather than as an issue of colonialism and land theft, and settler colonialism. Obviously Palestine is an issue for Muslims, but it's not merely a Muslim issue.
Clearly there are a lot of Christian Palestinians and Jewish Palestinians.
Exactly, and creating this false binary between Arab and Jew, when the history of the Arab world before the creation of the bloody creation of the state of Israel, Arab Jews were really significant in the Arab world and played a big role Take Egypt, for example. Like a lot of the communist parties that were started in Egypt in the 20s were started by Egyptian Jewish communists.
Yeah.
One thing that was rubbed in us from us in the Arab world, the creation of the Zionist state forced this sectarianism, put this wedge between Arab and Jew, and stalled this development of like Arab Jewish thought further.
Yeah. So, walk us a bit through the history of the like pan-Arab or the Arab nationalist or the Arab socialist movement when it comes to Palestine, and what a figure like the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser was trying to do in the 50s and 60s vis-a-vis Palestine. There's a common saying in Arabic, "Palestine satataharrar min al-Qahira." Palestine will be liberated through Cairo. Walk us through what that means and historically how that was spoken about.
Historically, Palestinians and Arabs have long understood that Zionism and Western imperialism are intimately intertwined, and that at their base, the two ideologies fundamentally seek the same things. And we're seeing that other people are recognizing this now, but it was, the Arab reality for a long time since the Nakba and the creation of the Israeli state in 1948. I'm going to start a bit before the 50s and 60s just to have this frame of reference and understand what the Arab world was like. So there's often this ahistorical view that Arabs have always had sectarian strife and conflict, that it's always been a war-torn area, but that is not the case historically. In fact, like I said, Arabs have shown time and time again how they, apart from faith, have tried to come together against imperial and colonial violence. Prior to the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, for example, there was still a strong sense of Arab identity that was formed because of shared language and culture. And it was titled the Nahda, or the Arab Awakening or Renaissance.
Yeah.
There's a book by Professor Osama Maqdisi that's about this period of history, and he uses this term. He says that Arab was an ecumenical identity.
Right. The book Nihal is referring to here is called Age of Coexistence, the Ecumenical Frame and Making of the Modern Arab World by Professor Osama Maqdisi. Ecumenical is a term originally meant to represent different Christian churches, but here it's used to refer to the huge cultural, ethnic, religious, political, and even linguistic diversity within the so-called Arab world. A book I'd love to read and an academic I'd love to have on the show.
Like this, it was like an umbrella identity under which a lot of things could encompass it. It's to stress that the Arab ideology was not based on religious identity. I know that we might find it hard to believe now, but there were left-wing and right-wing Christians, Muslims and Jews, and ideologies were not based on religion, unlike what we see today. And then, after that, direct French and British colonial rule infringed upon that, especially with the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1917 that saw the artificial division of Arab borders.
Yeah.
The same year as the Balfour Declaration that sees the British hand over Mandate Palestine to the Zionist project. So, in the book, he talks about how this division, as well as the establishment of the State of Israel, put this sectarian strain and created the like I mentioned, this binary between Arab and Jew that we see today that didn't exist before. One thing that's really important, the main critique against the establishment of Israel, it was not European, Jewish immigration only. It was the insistence by the European Zionists or the colonial Zionists an ethno-state should be created on the basis of religion and coercing the native population to accept it.
Yeah.
So one thing that comes out of this is that the residents of the land saw this as actually a really old-fashioned, regressive way of understanding state building, and that this colonial Zionism was opposed to this ecumenical or universal nature of the region. It was seen as anti-modern, morally regressive, and inciting religious fanaticism. And it interrupted progress that, a lot of Arab radicals and thinkers and intellectuals were talking about. Like religious exclusivity as well as colonialism was seen as something from another age,
Yes.
which is very different type of political project than what existed. And obviously, this is not to romanticize what was happening at the time. Like, obviously, it wasn't like, a paradise, but there were, like you said, there were several Arab radical political projects that existed at the time, whether it's Arab nationalism, Pan-Arabism, Baathism, the seeds of which were starting to be budding at the time. But there were all of these Arab radical traditions, and then at the same time, there was this regressive colonial project, this regressive ethno-state that was forced on the region. At a time when Arab political movements were trying to reject religious division. So this was the period right before the 50s and 60s. And, Ghassan Kanafani, for example, the Palestinian author, when he was talking about the Arab revolt of 36 to 39 in Palestine, which was against the British colonialism and Zionism. At the time when Ghassan Kanafani was writing about it in the 1970s, he talks about the triple threat. He criticized three things, and it was Zionism, the regressive Arab reactionary regimes, and then the Palestinian bourgeoisie. And he saw the Palestinian revolution as part of wider Arab revolutions. And he saw like Palestine as part of this, what was happening around it in the Arab world. So it was not this limited idea of, Palestine vis-a-vis Israel only, but it was, for the most part, historically an Arab issue. It's this like broader definition that seeks to understand the Palestinian question and the Palestinian revolution in relation to the surrounding regional dynamics of the post-Sykes-Picot Arab statehood and as embedded in the Arab world. We see after this sense of Arab identity, even after the creation of the State of Israel, to continue in different strains, whether it's Pan-Arabism that is most famously picked up by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who came into power and was given legitimacy first and foremost by fighting in 1948. 1948, we think about it in reference to Palestine, obviously rightly so, but also it was a humiliation for the other Arab armies that participated in it, including the Egyptian army, where Gamal Abdel Nasser fought and was wounded in 1948. And he gained a lot of his legitimacy from fighting there. And obviously there's a lot to critique about Gamal Abdel Nasser, especially from the left, especially in terms of repression of other leftist strains and communist strains that existed in disbanding all of the communist parties at the time.
Yeah.
But he had a project, right, which was an anti-colonial project that used Pan-Arabism and Arab socialism as its core tenets. And the central issue of this was the liberation of Palestine.
Yeah.
We might say that he used the wrong tools, or there were things that he could have done in a different way, or that the state repression was not helpful. But at least as an anti-colonial project, it was there, and he was serious about it. And obviously, this is not to deny the role of the Egyptian public who already espoused these, politics and ideologies that he just plugged into, basically.
Yeah.
And Sara Salem talks about this a lot in her book.
This is the London School of Economics Associate Professor of Sociology, Sara Salem, who wrote the 2020 book Anti-Colonial Afterlives in Egypt, The Politics of Hegemony, where she makes this argument about Nasser. She's another academic of Middle Eastern history I would love to speak to and recommend any listener to follow.
Which argues that Nasser was the only president and government that we had in Egypt that had hegemony, and that there was consent from the public as well as coercion. Yeah. And she says that's the only instance where there was consent from the public, who were obviously galvanized by this anti-colonial project, even as they saw a lot of drawbacks on the domestic side.
Yeah. I think it's clear to anyone who follows Egyptian history that Gamal Abdel Nasser, for all his faults, truly believed in what he was saying. I mean, there's nothing cynical about his politics. It's very clear that he literally believed in his project. But then it was kind of, I mean, it was completely reversed. And I've seen you write many times in your different channels that Anwar Sadat was the worst thing to happen to Egypt. What is the significance of the 67 defeat and Nasser dying, and then, you know, this kind of reactionary pro-Western faction of the free officers taking over and reversing everything?
Yeah, so basically, before we get to the 67 defeat, we should talk first about the decade that saw the most, you know, successes for Nasser, which is the 50s, which includes obviously the nationalization of the Suez Canal. And that moment was pivotal because there's an argument that Palestine is such an important colony for the West because of its location. And a part of that is because of you know, of how close it is to the Suez Canal as well. So when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, there was an immediate response by Britain, France, and of course the newly formed state of Israel. This immediate tripartite aggression that saw the displacement of actually Egyptian families in Port Said and along the canal cities. And if you go now to the canal cities in Egypt, actually they're the most ardently anti-Zionist Egyptians. There's an interesting interview with Amr Diab.
Okay, yeah.
Arguably the most famous pop singer, or one of the most famous pop singers in the Arab world, who's from Port Said, right? And they asked him, that's a bit of an old interview, and he says, they asked him about his support for Palestine, and he says, "Oh, my family was literally displaced twice in Port Said, like Amr Diab's own family, in 56, in the tripartite aggression, and then in the war of attrition that was after 67. So even if you take this example, when we think about, you know, this, why the Egyptian masses are pro-Palestine, it's not just, you know, solidarity. It's actual historical linkages, right?
Port Said was almost leveled to the ground. I mean, it was completely destroyed almost.
Yeah, it was completely destroyed, and a lot of people, some of the, you know, historical analysis that irks me a bit is that, Gamal Abdel Nasser was militarily defeated completely, but it was like the intervention of the U.S. only that forced Britain, France, and Israel to back down. But that's not entirely true. There was a lot of resistance from from Egyptians in those canal cities, and they fought really bravely. They're even called Fidaiyin in those canal cities.
Fidaiyin was the name given to the volunteer fighters who launched strikes against Israel during the War of Attrition in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Fidaiyin literally means those who sacrifice.
So I think any history should take into account the role of the masses as well, rather than this top-down approach.
For sure.
After the U.S. and the Soviet Union intervene, and Britain is humiliated, but then the U.S. specifically, starts seeing, how useful it would be having an attack dog in the region. And then the loss of 67 is really what cements that. You know, when you read accounts of the 67 war, it's really astounding. Anything, every single thing that could have gone wrong went wrong.
Yeah.
Every single variable.
Yeah.
If one thing hadn't gone wrong like that, maybe the loss wouldn't have been as huge. But there were a lot of factors. Nasser had most of his army in Yemen.
Yeah. A bit of background here on why tens of thousands of Egyptian soldiers were bogged down in Yemen. Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Egyptian state pledged to support many anti-colonial and progressive movements across the Middle East and North Africa, like the Algerian anti-colonial resistance. In Yemen, a civil war was waging between the progressive Yemen Arab Republic and the reactionary Saudi-aligned Yemen monarchy. As many as 70,000 Egyptian troops were sent to Yemen during this time.
The Soviet Union promised to help, but it didn't. There was miscommunication, a lot of different factors, but
a significant part of it was, like you said, just chance, just like fluke, weird things that happened.
Exactly. And a lot of things that people attribute to Nasser was actually the fault of Abdel Hakim Amir, his military general. And obviously it's Nasser's fault for trusting in him that much. But anyway, the 67 loss was so huge and so humiliating that it effectively killed any ideology that Nasser espoused, be it Arab socialism, be it pan-Arabism, be it any radical left ideology, even though these ideologies preceded Nasser, but just because he embodied them so much and that the hope was so big, that it effectively, killed that. And people moved away from that afterwards.
Yeah, it was such a shock.
Attributing the failure of 67 to these radical traditions.
Yeah.
And this was really the moment where the US afterwards pledged full support to Israel because it was so tied up in the Cold War, and Israel proved to be useful for killing the spread of socialism and communism in the region for it without its direct intervention.
Yeah.
Joe Biden previously said famously, if there wasn't an Israel, we would have needed to create one way before he became president.
Yeah. Here's what Joe Biden said about Israel in a speech to the US Congress in 1986.
It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
A sentiment he reiterated in 2022.
I say this 5,000 times in my career. The iron-clad commitment the United States has to Israel based on our principles, our ideas, our values. They're the same values. And I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one.
So it's really this material relation. And then afterwards, it was like a full throttled support because it proved to be extremely useful, not only like militarily, but also ideologically, and thwarting any, radical Arab formations from having any longevity.
Yeah.
And even then, afterwards, obviously, there was a war of attrition because 67 resulted in the occupation of Sinai and the Golan Heights by Israel. And until then, there was a war of attrition, which saw the most famous incident of which the Bahr al-Bakr primary school next to Sharqiya governorate in Egypt was airily bombed, resulting in the killing of around, I think, approximately 30 primary school students.
Yeah.
And surprise, surprise, Israel's rationale was that there was an Egyptian military base next to the school.
Yeah, it's crazy how nothing changes.
Exactly. It's the same old, right?
Yeah.
So Nasser dies in 1970, a day before Black September, actually, in the Civil War.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, or on the day of Black September, which was like very, very ominous.
Very ominous. Wow, okay, interesting. Black September, which we briefly covered on episode 3 with Professor Khalid Fahmy, was in 1970 when the Jordanian monarchy under King Hussein fought a mini-civil war against the PLO, resulting in thousands of Palestinian casualties.
And then Sadat takes power, and in the beginning he used the same kind of rhetoric as Nasser. But I really blame the fact that Nasser didn't leave any mechanism in place or any left institutions to resist the shift that Sadat took Egypt in. So he was able to completely shift Egypt's ideology and economy from economic organization away from what Nasser wanted, basically. Obviously, that was in line with the global turn towards neoliberalism as well. Like there was a global turn towards that. But had there been stronger institutions in place, I don't think the shift would have been that smooth.
Yeah.
So that chose something called the open door policy, or the infitah, in which Egypt would be open for investment, basically. instead of being non-aligned or sympathetic to the Soviet Union, it would completely rely on the United States and be an ally of the United States. So a complete new formulation for Egypt.
So,
but
sorry,
still,
when we say no open to investment, that kind of sounds like, to many people, like a good thing or just kind of like a neutral thing. But like, what does that mean? What did it mean for Egypt and its economy and its industry?
So basically, when I say he's one of the worst things that happened to Egypt, because we see the effects of that until now, right? Where this idea that foreign investments are really good for Egypt, when in fact it's kind of kind of erodes Egyptian sovereignty over time.
Yeah.
For example, Sadat is the person that brought the IMF to Egypt. And in 1977, there was famously the bread uprising or the bread intifada. See, intifada,
Yep.
normal
Yep.
word that was used back in the day.
Yeah.
The IMF was brought into Egypt to give Egypt loans. And then their, most famous recipe, the conditionalities are that Egypt had to remove bread subsidies, which were, under Nasser's government, something that Nasser espoused to be the state's role to provide welfare for its citizens.
Yeah.
So that was really entrenched in the Egyptian psyche at the time, that the state was a provider. So obviously the shock therapy didn't really work because it was so unpopular with the masses that when Sadat attempted to remove bread subsidies overnight, the bread intifada happened. People took to the streets, and it's actually incredible if you go back and see. I encourage listeners to go back and see the signs that the protesters had at the time. It was really like, against neo-colonialism, against the IMF. Like, people understood what was happening.
Yeah.
After Sadat deployed the military to disperse the protesters, and obviously he called people protesting thieves, he called them thugs.
Yeah.
He didn't contend with why they were protesting, but still the subsidy removal was reversed in 3 days, even after several protesters were killed and injured, but it was still reversed in 3 days. And instead, Egypt adopted this method of like slow, incremental removal of subsidies that we see until this very day, firstly employed by Sadat and then Mubarak, where it's, you remove beneficiaries from the subsidy system slowly over time, and then you also reduce the size of the loaf of bread.
Yeah, exactly.
So the subsidized bread is, instead it was like this big, now it's like this big.
Yeah.
Until the present moment, when you see Egypt extremely reliant on IMF loans and other loans from the Gulf. And that's something else that Sadat does as well, is bring, while Nasser was so reluctant to have, Gulf investments, as that would, erode Egypt's sovereignty. Sadat brought the Gulf in, which we see also until this present day, where the number one owner of Cairo after the Egyptian state is the UAE or UAE entities, basically. Yeah. Egypt's economy is so weak now and so reliant on foreign investments, then its sovereignty is eroded, right? And you see this argument when people are like, oh, why isn't Sisi doing more? Like, why is he that weak on Palestine? Why can't he stand up? Why doesn't he have a spine? And then people are like, oh, like Egypt's economy is so bad. He's reliant on the West for investment. He can't really do much. His hands are tied. But how did that happen in the first place?
Exactly.
Back to the 70s. Even then, as that was happening, we talk now about the student mobilizations in the US. But at the time, and there's a really good article by historian Rima Abul-Fadl about this, whereby she argues that the student movement in Cairo at the time, which was extremely pro-war against Israel, forced Sadat into the 1973 war.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people talk about, Sadat's shrewd genius going into the 73 war, etc. There was a huge student movement at the time that were protesting and disrupting almost weekly against, the Sinai being taken, against the Bahr al-Bakr massacre, or against Israel, basically. that was such a headache for Sadat that he needed to do something, which is why he started the 1973 war, or what's called the Yom Kippur War, the October War. He got some strategic wins in the beginning, in the first battle, and then Egyptian forces retreated after that. And there's a lot of contestation around this period. There's a memoir by a general from the time called Shazli, and it talks about the frustration of the military generals when Sadat pulled them back because they were gaining ground into Israel, and then Sadat basically issued an order to stop them. And there's a lot of arguments around. Sometimes people call Sadat a traitor for even doing that. I think his aim was to make a dent so he can negotiate, which is effectively what he did, and then which led to the Camp David Accords in 1978, where Egypt signed a peace settlement with Israel that was considered a shock across the Arab world and in Egypt, where Israel's biggest adversary was now neutralized, basically. And it's so funny, even reading Henry Kissinger's memoirs and notes about Sadat at the time, he makes fun of him all the time. He's like, he's just desperate for approval. Like every time I call him, he just gives me information. And when he was doing negotiations about how many Egyptian tanks, now it's called the Philadelphia corner, but the area in between. And then Sadat is like, any number, it doesn't matter. It could be 4 tanks. And Kissinger was shocked. The subsequent negotiations are really what we're living in until this very moment. As well as, Gulf loans, IMF deals, all of the stuff that started with Sadat's time.
And I think that brings us to the movement in around the year 2000 and the preceding years in the early noughts around the Second Intifada, which saw a new generation of Egyptians take to the streets to protest all kinds of things in Mubarak's sort of pathetic autocracy, but also the Palestine issue, even for a new generation. You quote Golda Meir and many other Israelis who had this idea that the old will forget, the old will die and the young will forget. And clearly, generation after generation of Egyptians just instinctively are extremely anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian. And so this movement that started in the early noughts, during the Second Intifada, then led up to 2011 and everything that happened there. And again, as soon as the Egyptian regime was toppled, I think the first thing that people did was raid the Israeli embassy. It's just such a natural aspect to Egyptian revolutionary politics is anti-Zionism. Talk a little bit about how that came about and the Palestine's role in 2011.
Yeah, so obviously the Camp David Accords were against the wishes of the Egyptian populace. Egypt was the first country that signed that normalized with Israel, but until now people are still ardently anti-Zionist. Under Mubarak there was some liberties in that people were allowed to protest for other issues if it wasn't against Mubarak, and one of that issues was Palestine, and the first Intifada saw that happening, and universities in Egypt, across Egypt, not only Cairo, protested the first Intifada, and then the second Intifada, which was also my first political memory, I think, saw a huge swath of protests across Egypt. In fact, there wasn't anything major that would happen in Palestine where Egyptian streets wouldn't respond, except basically under Sisi. But prior to that, there was always something that was happening. And there was this kind of method where Mubarak's people would call, ahead when something would happen in Palestine, would call universities and be like, okay, you can have your little demo, but as long as it doesn't leave the university campus, et cetera, et cetera. But then organizing for Palestine is one of the ways that Egyptians, had this institutional memory to protest that they took to the 2011 revolution. So it really paved the way across with along with workers' protests as well in Mahalla and other places. But that really paved the way for the 2011 revolution. And then we see that the first thing that happens, like you said, is the immediate invasion of the Israeli embassy in Cairo and the removal of the Israeli flag.
Yeah.
And then until now, like while there is an embassy in Maadi, but there's no flag, the flag doesn't fly in Cairo because of the period. And then obviously in 2012, one thing that immediately happened was a delegation of Egyptian, activists, journalists went into Gaza straight away, using that period of, political change to visit Gaza. And then there's this very moving video in Gaza as well, responding to the 2011 revolution, where Palestinians in Gaza take to the streets in the support of the revolution and are very moved, hoping that the siege on Gaza will be lifted. So there's this like instinctive and political understanding that our fates are tied together, right? Yeah. And then until this very moment after October 7th, like there was some, spontaneous student protests that happened after October 7th that were extremely quashed. And since October 7th until now, there is almost upwards of 177 prisoners in Egypt in solidarity with Palestine. Yeah. And the title of the chapter that you mentioned, Bread, Freedom in Arab Palestine, happened when Sisi, in an effort to test the waters sometime in October, allowed for state-sanctioned Palestine protests. And the protesters who went down to the streets broke away from the designated areas that the regime allowed for them and, broke free and went back to Tahrir Square and chanted for bread, freedom, in an Arab Palestine. And obviously that was immediate. There was an immediate crackdown as well, and more people were arrested.
I was there during those protests last year and saw how the police violently dispersed the crowds and arrested dozens. For a brief moment, though, when the crowds broke through the police barricade leading up to Tahrir Square, it was beautiful.
But still, that was the first time we saw protesters in Tahrir Square for several years. Yeah. You mentioned there's always a saying that the road to Jerusalem goes through Cairo, but it's really Gaza that's leading the way now, and it's causing people it's repoliticizing the Arab world, as we see different protests in front of the journalist syndicate that happens almost every week. We're seeing Egyptians try to organize a global conscious convoy that would go into Gaza, but obviously that is thwarted by the state. Yeah. Different political formations that are starting to show, like the group Egyptian Diaspora Resists, which is the first time I think Egyptians in the diaspora organized like that. Yeah. So it might not be what we want right now, especially as we're seeing, the massive demos that are happening worldwide and the student encampments in America, when we're used to seeing them in the Arab world first. Yeah. But given that this is the most repressive regime that Egypt has ever seen, we come to wonder why that is, Yeah.
Nihal El Aasar, thank you so much for speaking to us at Kalam Podcast.
No, thank you so much for having me. Really glad to be here.
That was the Egyptian writer, researcher, and DJ Nihal El Aasar, and the 10th episode of the Kalam Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said in the beginning of the show, I'm in Cairo for the next 2 weeks to give a talk and conduct interviews with Egyptians and Palestinians connected to the Palestinian issue. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us on Instagram at Kalam Podcast if you have any suggestions. Until next week then, that's it for us at Kalam Podcast. Kalam was written and hosted by me, Edgar Mannheimer. Research and production by Sam Karl Samra. Poetry reading in Arabic by Khulud Saghir. And sound design by Arthur Mannheimer.